Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wa sallallahu wa sallam ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa alihi wa sahbihi wa tabi'ina lahum bi ihsanan ila yawmiddin wa alayna ma'ahum wa fihim bi rahmatika ya arhamar rahimin. To proceed, this is our 53rd lesson in the Ship of Salvation, Safinatun Najah. We are on section 12, prayer conditions, and let us recall the meaning of a condition, and we covered these for al-wudu, ablution, and ghusl, and you could also call these the preconditions of prayer. And there we said a simple definition of a condition is ma yajibu taqaddumuhu ala shay'in wastimraruhu fi, that which it is obliged, that which is obligatory to precede a thing and persist throughout. It is that which it is obligatory that it precede a thing and persist throughout, right? A condition, it is obligatory that it precede a work and that it last till the end of the work. So these 8 conditions of the prayer, preconditions, they must precede the beginning of the prayer, the opening Allahu Akbar of the prayer, and last throughout the prayer to salams. During the whole time, these conditions must be present, otherwise the prayer is invalid. The author here says, section 12a, there are 8 conditions for the prayer, and these are preconditions, conditions for the validity of the prayer. If one of them becomes absent at any time throughout the prayer, that prayer is invalid. 1, purity from minor and major ritual impurity. He's going to define that, right? Basically, you've made wudu if you need to, and or ghusl. 2, purity from filth in one's clothes, body, and place of prayer. And previously, the word that he's translating here as filth, he translated as impurity, And because he said purity, he's got to say filth rather than purity from impurity. But basically, urine, blood, and those other things we listed as impure substances, and najasa, and we would at times translate them as filth in that chapter. One must be free from those. One's clothing must be pure from these types of najasa, filth, one's clothing, body, and place of prayer. One's clothing is everything that you're carrying in your prayer. So, for example, I am carrying this phone. This phone's in my pocket. That's considered clothing with respect to this definition. So my phone has to be pure. Were I wearing a ring or this shawl or anything I'm carrying, that is what's being called clothes here. The things you carry, your body, obviously that's your body. The place of prayer is everything that you and your clothes, by those 2 definitions we just gave, touch, right? Not what is not touched by any of your body or your clothing. So for example, if a man were prostrating and he's very spread out, immediately below his belly button there's a spot that's impure on the ground, that prayer is still valid because his place of prayer is only what his body touches or his clothing touches, right? So those must be free from those impure substances that we listed in the chapter of removal of filth and dealing with filth, impurities, and that body, clothing, place of prayer must be pure. La ilaha illallah. 3, covering one's nakedness, and it could also be translated legal nakedness, the aura. And in an independent section, the author is going to define these. So we're not going to go into them in detail. Just that the aura must be covered by something that is worn, not, for example, just darkness or standing in a little tent that conceals you from what's outside of it, but inside you're not wearing it. And the aura must be covered with a covering that prevents you seeing the complexion at a distance where you would normally speak to someone, and that's like 3 forearms lengths. That's in Arabic dhira, in English it's translated cubit, 3 of those lengths, and that is defined at about 48 centimeters, so 3 times that. 3 times that length. If you're sitting and looking at someone and you could not see their complexion through their clothing, that is considered a covering. if you can see their skin at that distance, then it is not considered an acceptable covering, right? So you have, in certain modern styles, our clothing may have rips in it, or modern and historical and contemporary clothing, it might be so sheer you can see the skin from beneath it. That's not an acceptable covering. If you can see the person's skin through it at that distance, it is not considered a proper covering. And then the person must be covered from the top and the sides, not from beneath, right? If from beneath you could see the skin, that's acceptable, because many of our garments, it's not possible to cover yourself from the bottom, but from the sides and the top. So, for example, men have to watch their neckline when they're bowing, right? If they have a loose neckline and they're bowing and you could see to below their belly button, that would not be considered acceptable. And also in the case of men, in the case of women, because it's their arms up their sleeves and what have you, from the top and the sides, it must cover the area that is regarded as awrah, and that must be worn, and it must be thick enough that it prevents the skin from being seen at a distance you would normally sit to speak to them, which is 3 forearms lengths, 3 cubits. La ilaha illallah. One point here, what about garments that are so tight you can see the shape of the awrah? However, you cannot see the complexion of the skin. That is legally offensive unless temptation and desire are feared when it is prohibited. And there are very firm hadiths that threaten that. So that's something that also should be avoided, even if we would say from a technical point of view, from the point of view of prayer, that's valid. Though the concerns that would render it prohibited are from the point of view of people seeing it and it causing temptation, a fitna, or desire, a shahwa. In that case, it would be prohibited to expose oneself before someone in that way. That is condition number 3. Condition number 4 is facing the Qibla, and the Qibla is the Kaaba, which is Allah's house. One faces that with one's chest, right? Qibla is to be faced with one's chest. 5, that the time for prayer enters. And that is that you have knowledge of the prayer time entering by certainty, meaning you're 100% sure. Saw the sun fall below the horizon. Or what's called a dhann, confidence. You're confident, though not 100% certain. Or, and that's dhann would arise from ijtihad, like a sign. And then there are levels of awareness of the prayer time entering, and also someone informing you based on knowledge is acceptable, and there are other acceptable ways to gain that awareness that are mentioned in more lengthy treatments that are beyond our scope. 6, knowledge of the obligation of the prayer. So that means we must know that the prayer we're performing is an obligation, if it is an obligatory prayer. So someone who is wavering about whether or not this is an obligation, it's not valid from that person. 7, not to believe that a pillar of the prayer is a sunnah. So what does that mean? We are going to cover a section describing the pillars, or you might translate them, obligatory integrals, those 17 pillars or obligatory integrals of the prayer. This condition means you may not, while performing a specific obligatory integral, believe that that integral is a sunnah. So, for example, standing erect in the prayer when we're reciting Fatiha at the beginning of the prayer. While performing that, we may not believe that standing is just a sunnah, right? So there are various possibilities for these cases. One, a person can discern between all of the obligatory integrals and the sunnahs of the prayer. So they know all 17 of these pillars are obligatory integrals. Or a person, and they know the rest are sunnahs. Or a person could think the whole prayer is obligatory. Both of those cases, no problem. Or a person could know there are obligations in the prayer and there are sunnahs in the prayer. However, they don't perform any specific obligation thinking it's sunnah, but they couldn't discern which is which and list them all. That is acceptable from a common person, not from someone who is knowledgeable. And that is the view of Imam Rumli, that a knowledgeable person must be able to discern what is an obligation from what is a sunnah. Ibn Hajar said both of the cases are acceptable from both a common person and someone who is more learned. La ilaha illallah, that was 7. And 8 is abstaining from that which invalidates the prayer, and that will be an independent section. We'll have an independent section where we'll cover the things that invalidate the prayer. So we must avoid those things that invalidate the prayer. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grant us to pray prayers that are valid. And as we have stated in previous sections, basically in these acts of worship, we need to know the obligatory integrals and we need to know the conditions. We also need to avoid the things that invalidate that work in order to perform a valid work. So these conditions are necessary for the validity of our prayer. And generally, conditions are necessary for the validity of any of our acts of worship. And valid means that you don't have to make it up. So practically speaking, if we miss one of these conditions, we have to repeat that prayer. Or if we learn that we missed it after the prayer time went out, we have to make it up. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وآله وسلم والحمد لله رب العالمين.